The roles and powers of the opposition and shadow ministry is an important syllabus dot point. Not only is the opposition a crucial institution within the Commonwealth Parliament, but it links to a number of other areas within our course as a result. If you have a strong opposition, many consider the functions of the Commonwealth Parliament to be enhanced. For instance, representation of more minority viewpoints, or certainly non-government viewpoints, accountability of the executive, the Parliament having a greater ability to hold them to account. However, on the other hand, you have other functions like the efficient passage of legislation and the formation of a stable government, which might be inhibited. Some consider there to be an inverse relationship between the Prime Minister and the powers of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the opposition. So if you have a strong opposition, by default, the Prime Minister and Cabinet struggle to fulfill their functions and to exercise their powers a little more. You obviously have the role of the opposition throughout the lawmaking process, and we've seen the opposition, in the case of Mr. Albanese's opposition, be quite effective in blocking legislation in the Senate, in voting for amendments in the lower house with the religious freedom bills, and even in negotiating changes to laws through proxy, through the Australian Council of Trade Unions with JobKeeper. So clearly quite an influential institution within our parliament. It is well worth revising the opposition simply because it connects to all of these other areas of the course. So, do you actually know your opposition? Aside from Anthony Albanese, the leader of the opposition currently as I record this, do you recognise any of these other members of Labor's shadow cabinet? Do you know their portfolios? You certainly might recognise some familiar faces. It is important to know a few of these shadow ministers and their portfolios so that when you are talking through examples, you are able to be as specific as possible and articulate their effectiveness in their portfolios. So for instance, if you want to talk about the effectiveness of Senator Katie Gallagher in the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19 in holding the Morrison government to account, knowing that she's the manager of opposition business in the Senate is quite important. If you want to talk about, let's say, Labour moving amendments in the lower house, knowing that Mark Dreyfus as the Attorney General will be the one to move most of those amendments is also quite useful. If you want to talk about, in terms of the election campaign, some of the debates or the specific ministerial debates that have occurred, such as the debate between Brendan O'Connor and Peter Dutton over defence, again, it is useful to know who these people are and where they stand. It is also useful to know some essential terminology, which is listed on the left there. Down the bottom of this slide, I've tried to give you an indication of where the opposition has come up in previous WACE exams. At times, it's packaged in with the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is not surprising. And other times, it's a standalone point in a short answer question, talking about two disadvantages faced by the opposition, talking about what a shadow minister is and what roles they have. So it's important to look at the syllabus dot point on its own, but also how it links into others. Coming back to those essential terms as our starting point for this, here is a strategy that might help you get a leg up on them. So remember, knowing how to define a term is often not enough in politics and law. It will often get you a mark in a 2-mark question, or it might be a solid start of a 5 or 6 or 8-mark question, or even a paragraph. But often you will need to add an additional piece of information, an example, an indication of the term's purpose or significance or how it relates to the politics and law course in order to secure yourself full marks. So here's something that you can do to help you with that. We're all familiar with flashcards and how they work. This strategy, called Definition Plus One, actually gets you to write out the definition in full on a flashcard, and rather than trying to remember that definition, you are trying to add something to that definition, a second mark, something worthy of a second mark. So if we have this term here, just the opposition, the party or coalition with the greatest number of non-government members in the House of Representatives, here are some options for what you could add to it. You could discuss the purpose of the opposition to scrutinise the actions and policies of the government. You could discuss its significance, that it's a recognised institution, that Parliament's functions are at least somewhat dependent on the opposition. And ideally, you could have an example to go with this. You could discuss the Albanese opposition that, as of the time of recording, it had 68 seats in the House of Representatives. You could discuss its distinctive policies. So, for example, the Independent Corruption Against Commission, wage theft. So, the idea of this routine is to get you to add those additional details yourself, to assist you, particularly in completing short answer and source analysis questions that are worth 2 marks, but also to assist you in adding additional information to your other answers as well. So, here are some pretty essential definitions. Something that really helps me when there are a number of definitions that are quite similar to each other, for instance, the shadow cabinet and shadow ministry, is to visually illustrate the difference between them. I've done this with the opposition. I've also done this with the Prime Minister and Cabinet, showing the difference between Prime Minister, Cabinet, and then the broader ministry. Here we have a useful visual diagram that shows us that, well, obviously the leader of the opposition is just one person, we know that. The shadow cabinet is a group of the most senior members that mirror the cabinet counterparts and adopt ministerial portfolios. And then you have the shadow ministry, which also have ministerial roles, but they are not as senior, and they tend to mirror ministerial roles that are not in a cabinet. This is just another way of ensuring that you can distinguish between similar terms, because again, as we know, with 3-mark answers, that often appears. So if you got a question distinguished between the shadow ministry and the shadow cabinet, would you be able to do that? Let's get into the roles of the opposition itself. We can say that the opposition has 3 main roles: to present itself as a credible alternative government, to generate alternative policies and present them in Parliament, and to scrutinise the government holding ministers and their departments to account. Now, what is important is that for each of these aims and roles, you know how this is achieved in theory, and then examples of that being carried out successfully, but also examples of where the opposition struggles to fulfill those roles. With your examples, you are looking obviously for successes and failures to generate a rich discussion. You are also looking for current examples and historical examples, because at times, examples from the 45th or 44th, even the 43rd Parliament, will be more illustrative of the strengths and weaknesses of the opposition than current examples where the composition of Parliament prevents certain things from happening. This will become a bit clearer as we move forward. This table can be really useful. I know tables, I'm sure students often look at it and go, oh, that's a bit boring, but it is a really efficient way of recording information and organizing information visually so that when you look back on it, you are not completely baffled by all of the words that are on the page. So, our first role is to generate alternative policies and present them in Parliament. Here's something that's quite important to know. How are policies actually made by the opposition, whether it be a Labour opposition on the right or a Liberal opposition on the left? Because obviously within the last 10 years, we have had both. We've had the Abbott opposition to the Gillard and Rudd governments, and we have had the Shorten and the Albanese oppositions to various Liberal prime ministers. I'm going to focus specifically on the Labor opposition because they have been opposition for some time, but I have put the Liberal policy-making process there as well. So, with Labor, they hold a national conference every 3 years. The most recent one was in 2021. This is a critical part of the policy-making process because it is where delegates from across the country come together and they vote on what their platform is going to be. Their platform being a series of policies, objectives, and a statement of what Labor really stands for. This national conference is attended obviously by members of the Parliamentary Labor Party, that is Labor members that are in state and federal parliaments. You have, as I said, state delegates. You have other delegates from unions, from Young Labor, from other related organisations. And all in all, you have 350 to 400 delegates come to this national conference and debate and vote on policy. Now, that happens every 3 years. So in between those 3 years, you need a national executive who are this sort of leadership and governing body, this chief authority, who then are in charge of interpreting, I guess, ruling on the national platform and determining what the party will focus on. However, not all of the people in the national executive sit in Parliament at a state or at a federal level. So the Parliamentary Labor Party refers to all of the Labor MPs that have been elected both to the Senate but also to the House of Representatives. You might hear this referred to as the caucus. They are in charge of actually implementing, developing the practical policies, the legislation or rather the bills and draft amendments that will actually be put forward to Parliament. They cannot actively go against the national platform developed by the National Conference, which is seen as a very representative platform, but they can interpret it and decide what to prioritise. Now, obviously not every member of the Parliamentary Labor Party has equal influence. That is where the shadow ministry and the shadow cabinet come into play. As the senior members within the Parliamentary Labor Party, they are the leadership group. They will play a bigger role in determining what to prioritise. But again, they cannot go against the national platform developed by the National Conference. And if they vote against it in Parliament, according to the Labor Constitution, they are at risk of being expelled from the party. They have very tight party discipline within the Labor Party. So, do we have an example of a policy being made and put into practice? ICAC, the National Integrity Commission, otherwise known as the Independent Commission Against Corruption. According to the ALP National Platform, they want to establish a powerful, independent and transparent commission to investigate corruption. This is an alternative to the Morrison government's model, who also has a model for an ICAC, but one that is slightly less powerful. So it couldn't conduct public hearings, it wouldn't be able to release public reports. It would obviously be able to order documents similar to what a committee can do in the Parliament, but they also would not be able to make recommendations for criminal prosecution. So Labor's model has got more teeth, so to speak. This is an example of a clear difference between, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, or the opposition in the government. But at times, it's important to remember that an opposition will benefit from mirroring government policies with minor adjustments. So when we think about the religious discrimination bills, both Labor and the Liberal Party both were in favour, generally, of a religious discrimination bill. However, Labor wanted to put in place protections against religious vilification, with some exceptions, and they wanted to put in place protections for LGBTQIA students in religious schools, particularly transgender students. In terms of immigration, again, both parties have very similar policies. They both support offshore processing currently. They also support boat turnbacks. However, when it comes to temporary protection visas, this relatively narrow issue, that is where the parties diverge from one another. So, here's an example of the Labor Party trying to put one of the policies in their platform into practice. So during the debates over the Religious Discrimination Bill, the Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus moved an amendment to that Religious Discrimination Bill that failed. It attempted to prohibit religious vilification with a number of exceptions, some of which are very broad. For instance, for any purpose that is in the public interest in terms of any statement, publication, discussion, or debate that is held in the public interest. So quite a broad exception there. So here, Mr. Dreyfus and the Labor Party are trying to put in place one of their policies that's in their platform. That is, they want to prohibit religious vilification. In this case, though, they were ineffective because there was a very close vote and it failed by one vote. This brings us to parliamentary procedures. So once they have these policies, how do they actually go about putting them into practice and trying to enact them? The opposition has access to parliamentary procedures. It has a strong conventional role. It is recognised within the standing orders and often has equal opportunity, quote, equal opportunity to participate in debate. So, for instance, under Standing Order 63A, when a minister makes a statement to the House, the leader of the opposition or the equivalent member of the shadow ministry may reply in turn. This indicates that the opposition can use parliamentary procedures to frustrate the government agenda, they can scrutinise the government, and they can present their policies. However, in the House of Representatives, we know that the government elects the Speaker, the government can amend the standing orders by a majority at the start of a parliamentary session, and can use different standing orders to limit debate and increase efficiency. Now, over here, where I'm circling now, these are a number of different procedures. You do not necessarily need to know all of them, although that would work to your advantage. It is important to recognise that some of these are more significant than others. For instance, grievance and adjournment debates are part of the routine of Parliament. When you look into them, they don't have a lot of effect. They are often utilised by Labor, and particularly by Labor backbenchers, to scrutinise the government and air grievances from their electorates. But they are not what you would call discrete or rich examples. Discrete being you're able to single out a moment in time and say this is an example that happened on this particular day. Rich being that they might link to other syllabus dot points. However, motions of censure and motions of no confidence are extremely important in that they are, if used successfully, extremely effective. They result in the resignation of a minister in the case of motions of censure, or in the case of motions of no confidence, the government. However, they never work. They never pass. We haven't had a motion of no confidence in the lower house since 1940 under the Fadden government, when the Fadden government's budget was amended by £1. And motions of censure do not pass in the House of Representatives. They only pass in the Senate, where they don't result in resignation. We have question time and the refusal of pairs, where in previous years, even this year, in terms of question time, we have seen unique examples of the opposition using these procedures to frustrate the government. On the other hand, even though they're not on this list, we know that gag and guillotine motions work to the opposition's disadvantage. So rather than trying to discuss all of these parliamentary procedures and processes, picking out a few of them will work to your advantage. So let's find some useful examples that are discrete and rich. Here's one. So, in 2020, the Senate censured Richard Colbeck, who was the Minister for Aged Care, for failing to recall basic facts about the impact of COVID-19 on aged care, in particular how many people in aged care had died as a result of COVID-19. This is a censure motion. It expresses the Senate's disapproval of the minister's conduct. However, because it was in the Senate, Minister Colbeck did not have to resign. This illustrates an opportunity that the opposition took to criticise a minister and fulfil one of its roles. However, it also represents a limit to that. It also links nicely to the accountability of the executive and the functions of Parliament. Here we have crossbenchers celebrating after their successful amendment of the Medivac bill in early 2019. The lower house and the Senate successfully amended the Home Affairs Legislation Amendment Bill to have the minister's decision regarding medical evacuations from Nauru be reviewed by an independent panel of doctors, with the potential for them to overrule the minister's decision should they find that a medical evacuation is necessary or unnecessary. Despite the fact that there was a hung parliament because Julia Banks left the Liberal Party to sit on the crossbench as an independent, and Karen Phelps was elected in the seat of Wentworth as an independent. So despite it being a hung parliament, and despite the government losing a legislative vote on its own bill in the House of Representatives, which has been unprecedented for some time, there was no motion of no confidence. The opposition did not test the Morrison government's majority because both of these independents said they would back the Liberal Party in matters of confidence and supply. So again, we have a moment where the opposition has fulfilled some of its roles in scrutinising the government, in enacting some of its policies in terms of putting forward successful amendments, but they have not been able to force the government to resign because motions of no confidence are extremely ineffective. In 2016, the opposition, led by Bill Shorten, refused pairs to the Turnbull government. Pairs being a convention where if certain members on the government side are going to be absent for a vote, they will be paired with a member of the opposition who will essentially not participate in the vote. What this means is that the government is not at risk of losing a legislative vote because of illness or because of emergency situations that emerge. In 2016, the Shorten opposition refused pairs to the Turnbull government. Because pairs are a convention that are worked out between the opposition and the government, they were able to do this without much consequence other than just criticism. As a result, one night in 2016, the Turnbull government lost some procedural votes over a banking royal commission. Some of their members, including Peter Dutton, had gone home early, thinking that the Parliament, all the important business of Parliament had been concluded. And the Shorten opposition moved to bring debate on a banking royal commission forward, and they succeeded. This is a great example of the opposition using parliamentary procedures in tandem with a narrow government majority to hold the government to account, to scrutinise their conduct, and also to bring forward debate on a policy that they were in favour of, a banking royal commission, which eventually took place. And finally, we have Albanese's budget reply. I put this in here because the budget reply is it is part of the routine of Parliament in the sense that it happens every year, but Albanese's was quite unique in that it went for 30 minutes. And certainly in the lead up to an election year, he was seeking to present the Labour Party and the opposition, as well as himself, as a credible alternative, particularly given the government's line that opposition, the Labour opposition, were not responsible and would not be responsible in managing the economy. However, there is one parliamentary procedure that seems to be more impactful than the others, and that is a division. Divisions are a formal vote within one of the houses where members move to one side or the other and are formally counted as for or against a motion being put. So divisions can be called on bills themselves. They can also be called on procedural motions, for instance, that a member no longer be heard or that the question be put to a vote. So, throughout the legislative process, the opposition may attempt to block or amend a bill against the will of the government through participating in divisions. And in doing so, it attempts to hold the government to account, advance its own policies, and generate critical debate. Here we would link back to a contemporary example involving the legislative process for Year 11, but a contemporary example involving political power for Year 12, that being the religious freedom bills. So here we have the opposition supporting the package in principle in the second reading. So they voted with the government and said we support generally a religious freedom bill. This was them drawing on the 2019 election, thinking that one of the demographics where they struggle the most is religious communities, and so supporting a religious freedom bill would certainly work in their favour. However, during consideration of detail, they criticised the lack of protection for transgender students in religious schools specifically. They unsuccessfully moved an amendment on religious vilification in the House of Reps. This illustrates that divisions do not, in fact, rarely work to the opposition's advantage because they do not have a majority in the lower house. However, in the upper house, they can successfully block legislation when they team up with the crossbench. So, for example, them blocking in 2020, they blocked the migration amendment prohibiting items in immigration detention centres bill with the crossbench members such as Jackie Lambie. However, back to the religious freedom bills, they were able to amend the government legislation by essentially handing Rebecca Sharkey an amendment and having her move it instead. They voted with her. A number of Liberal backbenchers, such as Trent Zimmerman, came across and voted with them as well, forcing the government to withdraw the amended bills in the Senate as they were going to pass in a form they did not particularly like. Another area where the opposition can be quite effective is in parliamentary committees. So all opposition MPs are private members and can sit on parliamentary committees. We must remember that ministers cannot. So whilst members of the shadow ministry and the shadow cabinet can participate in committees and often must, as the senior members of the opposition, ministers will simply be called before a committee and be questioned by them. We also have to remember that committees exercise considerable power. They have the power to compel the production of documents, they can call witnesses, and they can often be very well informed, for instance, by reports by the Australian National Audit Office. And a good example here would be sports frauds. So the Auditor General's report into the administration of sporting grants informed broader queries to Sports Australia brought before Senate estimates in 2020 about the administration of sporting grants seemingly more to marginal electorates than to non-marginal or safe seats. We've seen criticism of ministers, so the most recent being the criticism of Minister Richard Colbeck, who's Minister for Aged Care but also for Sports, for only appearing before a COVID-19 committee on 2 out of 56 occasions, and on one of those occasions going to the cricket instead, but again, as Minister for Sports, perhaps his role. We also should remember that the Senate can actually disallow government regulations, and with a lack of a government majority in the Senate, that presents an opportunity to the opposition to really utilise committee recommendations to disallow delegated legislation made by government ministers. And you have an example there, the Australian Renewable Energy Act which would have allowed Mr. Alan Tudge, I believe, to essentially adjust regulations surrounding the Australian Renewable Energy Act to invest in clean hydrogen and invest in some non-renewable energy sources, which wasn't necessarily permitted, wasn't necessarily the purpose of that act in the first place. Outside of the Parliament, the opposition can obviously use their access to media to promote their policies, to scrutinise the government, and with an increased focus on leadership, Anthony Albanese, or the leader of the opposition, plays a very, very important role in this. Certainly, if we think about the government, that we've seen this more presidential executive, where the Prime Minister plays an integral role in presenting policies to the public. That is mirrored in the focus on the leader of the on the leader of the opposition during an election campaign. What's important to remember here is that impact can vary widely with the media, and it can often depend on the timing. So is there an election campaign, for instance, happening? It can depend on government performance. So if the government is struggling a little bit in terms of their engagement with the media, the opposition can probably take advantage of that. If it depends on party cohesion. So if you have, for instance, Mr. Fitzgibbon in the opposition, who was very critical of Labor's stance on climate change and wanted to invest more money in coal communities, or poor coal mining communities, that can not look as cohesive to the media and can certainly impact your credibility. It can vary by your campaign strategies. So throughout, especially in terms of an election, your plan to engage with the media and in what ways you do so, whether through traditional media or social media. And it can also depend on what media outlet you are engaging with, because they may have a particular agenda or a particular focus, and that may favour the opposition or undermine them. Let's have a look at some examples. So, in January and February, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition addressed the National Press Club. The Prime Minister didn't have a great time of it in trying to address the National Press Club and taking questions from the media. Journalist Peter Van Wonselen stood up and said, "I have some texts from former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian that basically criticise you, call you an inept leader." Understandably, Prime Minister Scott Morrison struggled to deal with that in the moment. So quite an embarrassing moment for him. On the other side of things, Anthony Albanese took advantage of the National Press Club address and presented his economic policies. It was his first, given the fact that we were having an election in May 2022, this was his first major moment where he could come forward and say, "This is my plan for the Australian economy." And certainly did not have as hard of a time. So that's an example of the opposition being able to use a particular outlet, that is the National Press Club, more effectively to present their vision, whilst also probably benefiting from the government's embarrassing situation. But with the positive must come the negative, and the election campaign has certainly been a bit of a rocky start. So prior to the election campaign, we had the unfortunate death of Senator Kimberley Kitching, who was a Labor senator. It was revealed that there had been some intra-party criticisms directed at her from, in particular, 3 Labor senators, there being Katie Gallagher, Christina Keneally, and Penny Wong. The media, or some parts of the media, I should say, attempted to portray them as quote-unquote mean girls. Not sure if I would use that phrase myself, but that is the phrase that was used. So this certainly presented, or it undermined the opposition's credibility, because it made them seem as if they were not a united front, and it certainly made them seem as if they were contradicting some of their values in practice. We also had during the election campaign a number of blunders in the media. So we had Anthony Albanese failing to recall basic statistics in terms of Australia's unemployment rate within the first week of the election campaign. Later on in the election campaign, he struggled to remember the principles underpinning his plans for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS. He has avoided gotcha questions, if you wish to call them that. He has avoided certain questions from the media, and as a result being characterised as, quote, running away from the media at times. So, given the Liberal Party's push to present Mr. Albanese as a risky leadership figure, as someone who cannot handle tough economic circumstances and doesn't have a secure plan, those moments in the media certainly did not help. Of course, we must also remember that there are other perspectives on this. So whilst I certainly presented the National Press Club address by Mr. Albanese as effective, others perhaps saw it otherwise. Because again, will the media focus on the leader of the opposition as much as they do the Prime Minister? Of course not. That's just one of the disadvantages of not being in government. Which brings us to the SWOT chart. This is the final slide. I promise I'm almost done. A SWOT chart is a really effective way of generating discussion. The idea of the SWOT chart is that when you're considering the effectiveness of the opposition, and this is not a complete SWOT chart by any means, this is just to illustrate to you how this strategy might be useful. When considering the effectiveness of the opposition, you think of the immediate strengths and weaknesses, that is, those that will always be in place regardless of the situation, most of the time. So we know always that the opposition has a recognised function established by convention. It's allocated time in debates, it has representation on House and Senate committees, it controls a substantial number of seats in both houses, and as a result can claim some opposition mandate to work with the Senate to amend, block, delay, and at least scrutinise legislation. On the other side, weaknesses, the opposition does not command a majority and therefore does not dictate the parliamentary agenda. Motions of censure and no confidence lack impact because in order for them to have impact, the government cannot have a majority in the lower house. And we know that the government can use standing orders to limit debate and to shut down the opposition. However, we must also realise that there are times, circumstances that arise that allow the opposition to take advantage of the situation. We can call these opportunities. And there may be other circumstances that appear every now and then that might completely undermine the opposition and result in a weaker opposition. So we can think of narrow majorities, which is certainly relevant for the 46th Parliament, which will allow the opposition to block or amend government bills more effectively, especially if you can entice a couple of members of the government to cross the floor, a la the religious freedom bills. They can more effectively use procedures like refusing pairs, forcing the government to depend on and organise their party so that every single member votes every time. Whilst the opposition may lack resources to institutions because they don't have access to the public service or the national cabinet, and they may lack experience, they may benefit from extra parliamentary resources. So in the case of the Labor Party, you have additional finances and additional information flowing through to you from unions. And a really interesting example of this is the Australian Council of Trade Unions being able to negotiate changes on JobKeeper with Christian Porter, managing to put in place protection for workers that were potentially going to receive these JobKeeper payments such that their employers did not force them to work additional hours during the crisis. Threats that may appear at times partisan speakers, so think Bronwyn Bishop ejecting 400 MPs under Standing Order 94A, and 393 of these being opposition members. You might have crises like COVID that elevate the government mandate and make it very hard to scrutinise or oppose emergency legislation, because if you do so, you're just undermining your credibility. And so throughout early to mid 2020, we barely saw the opposition in comparison to, say, prior to the election campaign, where they were far more active. Substantial majorities, like Abbott's 14-seat majority in after 2013, might absolutely lessen a mandate. It's very hard to claim you have a credible opposition mandate when you have such a deficit in seats. And this obviously might impact parliamentary procedures as well. And given that Abbott, or under the Abbott government, Bronwyn Bishop was appointed as Speaker, perhaps those examples can be used in tandem to indicate where the opposition might be less effective. So, with this chart, having just read through it all, it's really easy now to generate a discussion. If you are asked to discuss two disadvantages faced by the opposition in Parliament, you can draw on a strength. You can draw on a weakness or a couple of those weaknesses. Obviously, these are not a complete list. And then to generate discussion, provide a counterpoint, you can say, well, the opposition does not command a majority, but in times where there is a narrow government majority, they will obviously benefit from that. So you can use this chart to, if you have it in front of you whilst you're doing practice answers, I think it will benefit you. Obviously, the objective is to not have it in front of you at some point and still be able to recall these examples as well. All right. I think that is where I will end my recording. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been of some use to you.